And then there's Georgia. For a few weeks now, we've been covering sort of increasingly astonishing story about what is happening, not to politics broadly, but specifically to the election system in Georgia. One of the things that has happened over the last 4 years since Trump tried to overturn his election loss in 2020 is that the Republican Party has installed election officials in counties and states all across the country who not only parrot Trump's idea that the 2020 election was somehow stolen, but they have started doing what he wanted election officials to do for him in 2020. They have started refusing to certify election results. Now, they've done this in a number of states around the country, some blue states, some swing states, some red states. But the state where Republicans have done this more often than any other state in the country is Georgia. And Georgia, you will recall, is a state where Trump was indicted for multiple felonies under state law, including a RICO charge for his efforts to try to overthrow Georgia's election result in 2020, to try to get Georgia officials to declare that he was the winner, even though he had lost that state. Republicans are now trying these gambits to block the certification of election results everywhere, but they have been trying it most aggressively in Georgia. And over these last few weeks, a really alarming situation has emerged in Georgia because there is a newly appointed pro-Trump majority on the official Georgia State Election Board. And in recent weeks, they have passed a flurry of new rules that purport to legalize some of these tactics, that purport to empower local election officials to actually do this stuff, to block the certification of the vote or to delay the certification of the vote. And this state election board in Georgia is apparently planning to do much more of this, even as we are getting closer and closer to the election date. The Washington Post just reported that the election board plans to adopt nearly a dozen additional rules beyond the new ones they've just put into effect over coming weeks. Quote, despite warnings from state and local officials that the lateness of the calendar all but guarantees confusion and mistakes. And I think part of understanding the importance of this tactic is that confusion and mistakes are probably the point. It's one thing to say, we want the right to flip an election result. That's going to be sort of a hard sell. It's another thing to say, we want the right and we claim the right to essentially report that there's no knowable result here, that there isn't any discernible result, that there's a big question about it, that it seems like there's a cloud over the result. If you can not just flip the result, not directly flip the result, but instead just create a sense that there's some confusion, that there's some lack of clarity, that there's something wrong with the way the election was conducted. And so a result isn't organically and clearly emerging. That can justify doing all sorts of extraordinary, strange stuff to come up with what purports to be an election result in that state. So I will be honest with you. I have found that these actions by the state election board in Georgia have just been jaw-dropping. I mean, I've been covering this kind of stuff for a long time. I've covered a lot of different versions of different types of these things, not just in the Trump era, but from Republicans in all sorts of elections before this. But I've never really seen what's happened at this Georgia state election board in recent weeks. This isn't, just the Trump campaign making crazy claims or people advocating that the state do crazy stuff. This actually is the state. This is the official election board that sets the rules for how elections are handled in Georgia. And they're not just discussing crazy stuff. They are passing these rules that are Rudy Giuliani, hair dye dripping down the face crazy. And again, they're not just asking someone else to do crazy stuff related to the election. They are the elections board and they are doing it. So, I'll just be honest, watching the Georgia situation with their state election board these past few weeks has about tripled my blood pressure. It has been worrying me so much, I wrote an op-ed about it in yesterday's Sunday New York Times. And it is not like me to do something like that. But I have been very worried. But now I got to tell you, in today's news, something appears to be breaking on this subject. These shenanigans at the Georgia State Election Board have now provoked what Talking Points memo is calling, quote, ferocious pushback particularly from Georgia's own voter registration and election officials. Local officials have indeed been fighting these radical late changes to Georgia's election rules, these rules that really do seem to be designed to give Republicans cover to refuse to declare the official results of the election in November. Local officials, voter registration officials, local elections officials at the county level and beyond in Georgia, they have been pushing back vociferously. Today, state legislators and Democratic Georgia Congresswoman Lucy McBath spoke at the Georgia State Capitol demanding that this runaway election board be stopped, not only because they're substantively trying to mug the elections process in the state, but also because they're doing so in a way that seems to violate the rules by which bodies like this are supposed to operate. After that press conference today at the Georgia State Capitol, two really, really interesting things happened. First, the Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, did something very interesting. He made a request to the state attorney general asking for clarification, asking if he, as governor, has the power to remove members of the state elections board if it's warranted by ethics concerns. That is fascinating. We will see what the attorney general says in response to that query from the governor. I expect that the attorney general's response will likely come quickly. If Georgia Governor Brian Kemp then does decide to remove these pro-Trump election board members who have been upending that state's whole election process just weeks before the presidential election. Wow. I don't know. Watch this space. That would be a very, very big deal. So that's one very big thing that happened today. But then also, late today, a new lawsuit was filed from the Democratic Party of Georgia and the National Democratic Party. They say, quote, with support from the Harris-Walz campaign. As of tonight, they are suing the state election board in Georgia to stop them from what they've been doing. The Democrats' big new lawsuit, again, filed tonight, asks Georgia's state courts to make clear that local Trump loyalist officials don't actually get to make it up as they go when it comes to certifying the election results, no matter what the state election board has been telling them. Local officials can't just opt out of certifying election results. They can't decide on their own that they're going to delay the certification of the election results, presumably to try to blow through electoral college deadlines to prevent Georgia's electoral counts from being counted in Washington. The Democrats' lawsuit tonight asking Georgia courts to act quickly to clarify that what this MAGA Republican Elections Board in Georgia has been trying to do cannot be done, and that these rules they have purportedly tried to pass in order to give local elections officials all this leeway to mess up the vote count in Georgia, that leeway is not real, that legally they must certify and there's no way they can mess it up. So I'll tell you, honestly, I have been wondering and worrying for a few weeks now about whether the Democrats, pushback, their inevitable challenge to what the Trump folks have been doing in Georgia was going to be strong enough and whether it was going to come quickly enough to turn it around, to make sure that Georgia voters will be able to vote in a normal election where their votes are counted and the vote tallies are completed and are certified and they matter when it comes to picking the president of the United States. I mean, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are doing a Georgia bus tour this week, right? Harris is doing a big event this week in Savannah. They are going for it in Georgia as they should. But in a presidential election year, as important as it is to watch the way the two major parties' candidates are campaigning, to see the way they are competing to try to win the presidency, it is also worth watching what happens in the states. The radical stuff that Republicans have been doing to the Georgia state election infrastructure means that Democrats need to try both to earn people's vote in Georgia this year in traditional terms, but Democrats also need to fight this whole other fight to force the Republicans to actually consent to count the vote as well. As of tonight, we know what some of that Democratic pushback looks like. Quentin Fulks from the Harris-Walz campaign tells us this tonight, quote, for months, MAGA Republicans in Georgia and across the country have been trying to lay the groundwork to challenge the election results when they lose again in November. But Democrats are prepared, and we will stop them. Certifying an election is not a choice. It is the law. A few unelected extremists can't just decide not to count your vote. That's why we have won case after case in court, fending off MAGA efforts to chip away at our democracy. We will win this case too and keep fighting so that every eligible voter can confidently cast their vote, knowing it will count. Again, that statement tonight from the Harris-Walz campaign as the Democratic Party, both nationally and the Democratic Party of Georgia, filed this big pushback, this big lawsuit in Georgia to try to stop what Trump Republicans are doing there to mess up the vote count. Finally, a big Democratic punchback against what thus far are the worst election shenanigans in the whole country in the state of Georgia.